Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to today's session. We're going to be opening with a Slido poll. So for those of you who are familiar with Form, you can go straight to the left-hand side, open your QR reader, and you can get into it that way, which is the way that I'm going to enter it. The other way you can go is to go to slido.com and put the code in today, which is LM 180322, which is today's date. We're going to be opening with a short poll, and we're then going to be using Slido as we normally do for questions and answers. So if you have any questions for Chris, please do put those into the Q&A. And at the end, we will be running a feedback poll. So please do take a couple of minutes. It doesn't actually take that long at the end to give us your thoughts on today. It helps us to look at how we're doing and what we might do to improve. So let's have a look at, someone's already done the poll. Look, there's a 1 at the top. So Abraham, let's have a look at the poll. Slightly different poll today. Some of you will have a bit of fun of this. What's leveling up? Is it new hope or old rope? Okay. Says a little bit about our speaker, Chris. So the next question, please. The public sector is a strong driver of regeneration. Agree or disagree? And let's have a look at our third question. Now, can we choose more than one on this, Abraham, or is it just one only?
We can choose more than one. Yeah.
You can choose more. So what are the most common blockers in regeneration schemes? Is it money? Is it resource? Is it red tape? Is it skills? Is that a skills shortage, Chris? Is that our typo? Or is that another word or other? So what do you think? You can have more than one. And I've sent mine in.
I love the fact that a shills shortage, shill is an accomplice confidence trickster. So I think a shortage of confidence tricksters could be a...
Well, I'm sure they'll fit in there somewhere. Okay, so we have 10 people who've kindly given their thoughts. So while we go back, should we go through the, give you a bit of a sort of information now, Chris? Give you the answers?
Well, let's leave that running for a little bit and then let's...
Oh, we'll come back to it. Okay, so thanks everyone. If you want to carry on filling it in, I'm now going to hand over to Alison, who's hosting today. Though I do see our esteemed host is in the south of France. It's a terrible day down there. Shake your head, or if it's not, you know, just keep quiet. Over to you, Alison. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So while Andrew's enjoying all that the south of France has to offer, I'm here in sunny Buckinghamshire, so that's quite nice. Oh, we see Andrew. My goodness. Hello. Okay, so thank you. We're delighted to be joined by Chris from Trowers and Hamlins today. I think this is a really interesting topic, and you know, we've been waiting for this white paper for ages, and when it hit on the 2nd of February, I think we were all kind of studying it to work out, you know, what does this mean? Because we know this got a huge impact on the built environment, and you know, there's so many, it opens up so many opportunities. And to me, the levelling up agenda highlights just how important construction in the built environment is in societal transformation. How do we open up opportunities, social, economic, etc., for all parts of the UK? And I think this paper, it sets out quite a lot of that. But Chris, when we talk about levelling up, what do we actually mean?
Hiya, thank you. I've often thought as a development lawyer, we should be asking ourselves, what's land for, not what's it worth? And it strikes me that this is a big part of what this levelling up agenda is about. It's for the interesting part of the white paper is that the first 100 pages are a sort of historic analysis of societal inequality, and That's what this paper is really designed to push. Do we understand what it is? If we're thinking of from the public sector side of regenerating and regenerating sites, what are we regenerating them for? And I think this paper, it does, certainly the analysis part, the first 100 and odd pages of which I've now waded through, give us a really good reminder of what we're trying to achieve here. Every major city has areas of deprivation, areas of wealth, and we've got to try and get to that point now of working out what do we build in those areas that are falling down. So I think this is the whole point of this paper is designed to try and get us to a point of working out what it is we're meant to be building, where the shortages are, where the discrepancies are, and that we've still got an enormous concentration of social capital in London, in the southeast, and this paper, this analysis section is all about sort of highlighting where that discrepancy sits.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, that piece about not that inequality being in every place, because we've been doing some work with our regional partners around the value toolkit and looking at what value drivers there are. And actually, it's not that one part of a region's better off than another. It's to do with that access to transport, access to jobs, etc. And that can vary with just by a few streets away in many cases. But
and that's a funny thing about regeneration generally, and I think this paper really highlighted. I have to say, there's parts of this paper that I really welcome. There's parts of it that I'm not quite so sure about, but we'll come on to that in a bit of depth. And actually, just for the wider benefit of our colleagues in the audience today, rather than have a sort of presentation as we would normally would, we are just going to have a general discussion. So please do put your comments in the chat and join in as we go through. As I said, I often ask myself that question about what's land for, not what's it worth. And that's a really good reminder, I think, whenever we're doing regeneration, because otherwise we get this point of regeneration being done to an area. And we hear time and time again, we've all been to various conferences, and I'm sad I'm not at MIPIM this year. I had to give my pass back, unfortunately. And colleagues have gone, but the huge topic of conversation at MIPIM this year has been yet again, how do we collaborate? What are we collaborating for? How do we get community consultation? We can't just keep seeing every spot of land and thinking, haha, let's put houses there. Because if you just build houses, you don't build communities. If you don't build communities, you get skill shortages. This whole thing of what's that area meant to be for. And I think this levelling up agenda, it's not just about saying, let's supposedly inject wealth. Let's inject, we'll come on to it in a minute, but the whole idea behind this is about these different social capitals that we try and promote. And it's about looking at the whole of societal input, not just a wealth thing. It's about what drives wealth, what drives growth, what drives societal change, actually. That's the bit of this that I'm sort of quite keen on.
And do you think this is a new approach, or have we been there before?
Well, that's the interesting old rope on New Hope line.
Howard, how are we doing on the old rope or New Hope question?
Yes, let's flick to the poll and see what that looks like, if that's possible.
Yep, Abraham, let's bring the poll up. So just the first question.
Oh, New Hope.
Oh, New Hope.
Change his answer in head. Must be liked by audience. So what is it? Is that the case? Is it New Hope? And I think the reason why people might probably rightly swing to that conclusion, because you look at things like, when I first saw this paper, I thought, oh, is this just Labour's big society again? Is it just that? Is it another conversation about devolution? if it's devolution, is it backed up by the Treasury? So there's a whole sort of debate about, is this just a new version of what we've seen before? And I think it is a new hope. Whether the hope is going to be fulfilled is a different query. But what this paper does, it comes back to this idea, as I've said it already, about what's land for. So from a regeneration point of view, I think it is the first time. I mean, I've been doing this for quite a long time now, and in my 25 odd years of doing it, and very odd years they've been, I think it's the first time I've seen this collation of policy, rather than just, well, let's just increase planning, so we'll increase supply of land for housing. Or it's the first time I've seen. I think the nearest thing that came to it was, as I said, was Big Society, which is what, 10 years ago now, or if not longer. Which was about that was more about joining the social capital, whereas I think this joins infrastructure, purpose, land release, the whole stack of things that I think this attempts to bring together on a policy point. Alison,
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking actually, yes, none of those things are new, but bringing them together in this way at this, sometimes things fail, not because they're the wrong thing to do. It's just because not everything's in place. It's the wrong time, etc. And I think bringing things together in this way, we've got a hope actually.
Well, I think that's why there's three distinct sections to this report, to this white paper rather, and the analysis section I think is pretty sound. The sort of, well, what do we do with it after that bit, I think there's still work to be done there, because it leads to a so what question. But the analysis, that I think it's the first time I've seen this in this detail, which talks about all the reasons for the different levels of deprivation. What is deprivation? Is that just because I think people, when in regeneration context, we've talked about this a lot as poor quality housing, for example. So you think, right, well, a council who I might act for will say that housing estate over there is a bit beyond economic repair, so let's knock it down and start again. But then, or there's I live in Ironbridge in Shropshire, and right on our doorstep there is the former power station site, which will be decommissioned and will become a housing estate. And you have to think, why is that automatically the assumption that that's the thing to do with that site? There's no, and this isn't NIMBYism at all, I promise. But you do have to think, well, the power stations in other countries, when they've been decommissioned, they get turned into parks. Why do we assume that what we have to do with that bit of land is build a new town? There's no shortage of housing in this particular area. There's no, it's just an immediate assumption. And I think what this paper does is to say, let's look at the needs. Let's look at the transport. Let's look at the social capital. Let's look at the arts and culture provision. Let's look at the education, the skill sets. Mm-hmm. And then it gets back to this idea of not just what's a specific site for, but what's the area for. There's a really interesting section in this about skill collation in a particular area, and the West Midlands is identified as particular skill centres, and then you get into the whole Northern Powerhouse and all of those kind of slightly catchphrasey elements, but at least it gives some direction, I think. And I think so. Is this a new idea? I think it is the first time in a long time that we've seen a concerted effort to identify and analyse and explain what do we mean by the deprivation that we're then trying to level up. So I think it does do that.
And so give us a bit of a flavour for exactly what's in this paper, and what does it do, and what's its purpose really? Whoa.
There you go. Anyone speak? Yeah. So, I mean, I'm deliberately using the exec summary here. I promise I have read it. But I think what this designs to do is to identify these specific, it calls them the capitals, these 6 capitals. So physical, human, intangible, financial, social, and what's the other one? And institutional. And the idea is we'll take we'll identify those matrix and we'll use that to work out what's missing. But then what it does, it goes on to have these missions, talks about the missions, which gives a proper sort of policy output to what this is, to what's missing. And I think if you have that as an output based and evidence based series of discussions around what's going wrong, then you identify the problem before you identify the solution. It then takes you into a space of societal change rather than just specific sites. So we all can identify wherever we live. We can all identify big chunks of pre-industrial land, like power stations or what have you, or post-industrial wasteland, really, where you think, well, we can do something with that. But I think what this is designed to do is to say, well, how do we create and how do we spot? I was listening to an example the other day, and it said, for example, if you're in Manchester city centre and you've got pockets around, how do you know? How do you give life to those deprived areas around the city centre? Which, back to a point you made a minute ago about you can have a really wealthy town, but why does it have a poor area nearby? So this idea of this, I call it the Medici effect, about spilling out wealth from the centre and giving what's the word I'm looking for, a sort of boost to the areas around. And I think what this is designed to do, and what the analysis section of this does, is it helps us create outputs based upon a better understanding of where the deprivation happens. So I think it's looking at all of these connected areas, like transport, like skills, like art and culture, like job creation, and then what physical capital to invest in it, what buildings to put up, because you then know what the building's for. So this idea, it's really simple, back down to this idea of what's land for, not what's it worth. And I think this gives a fantastic sort of policy and analysis that sits behind that statement.
And I think that's probably where, especially if you're disposing, if a local authority or a government department's disposing of land, if they don't go for the highest value, highest price, they get there's a criticism, and actually it should be about what's the biggest impact, what's going to deliver the best results.
I was talking to Deborah Cadman in the West Midlands about this when she was chief exec at the Combined Authority. We did a podcast on this a year or so ago, and that topic of land valuation and the whole sort of valuation matrix, it has to be revisited, because if you're a disposing authority and you've got to get best consideration for the site, it does point you to certain uses. And I hate the fact that certain sites would be obvious. It would be obvious to make it into a public space or a park or whatever it is, but it always ends up gearing towards housing because that's the profit driver. And I think this paper is designed and hopefully will lead to a rethink of those valuation principles. So I'm doing work with our friends up in Wirral and the regeneration of the Birkenhead area and their Birkenhead 2040 plan. And you've got massive tracts of land which are former dockland, amazing sort of physical space. And you think, what on earth do you use that for? And there's loads of examples like that where the industrial use of a particular area has now gone. The shipyards, the coal yards, coal mines, whatever it was, from back in the 80s, as when the shipyards started to close. The immediate assumption is, well, we'll just build houses. But if you just perpetually build houses without the other infrastructure that goes with it, those houses just become the slums of tomorrow, just with a different set of exterior cladding. So it's got it's that idea of building things for the right reason. There's a message there about Plymouth. Let me just see what that says.
This one is Dunster. This isn't true for Plymouth. Yes, we dispose of land for housing, but we seek best value, not consideration. So we have lots of affordable, accessible housing instead of the highest price.
So I suppose the point there is, and thank you, Liz, for making that point. In the context of what we're discussing here, this is like a wider context. There will obviously be sites that are right for housing, or they'll be right for whatever other use. And that little interesting interplay between best value and best consideration. Well, Section 123 requirement is best consideration, but when you're talking about buying services, it tends to be then best value, and it's getting that little that's being lawyery and pedantic. But I suppose it's thinking about the best use of the site, and having the freedom to think what's the best thing to put on that site. So in your case, Liz, housing might be the best site, and it might be the best use of that site, and that's absolutely fine. I'm not for a second trying to suggest we shouldn't build housing. But you then get into the whole debate about, we decided there was a housing crisis, and the reports that came out, there's a housing crisis. Well, actually, there's an affordability crisis, and is the affordability crisis because actually when we build housing, we have to build it to ensure a 20% return for the developer, and it's that sort of link between use and value, as opposed to what's the best thing to do.
Yeah. I'm actually thinking of some really good regeneration schemes, like the old shipyards in Belfast, where they've turned it into the Titanic Quarter. They've used it they've nurtured a whole film industry off the back of that. And, it's now a really vibrant space, where once it was, it was a vibrant space, but it's now much more accessible to the public. And it probably would have been quite easy to just put some housing on there, but actually they've put economic infrastructure in, which has regenerated.
And I think the Belfast stuff, I think we advised on some of that. But leaving aside that blatant self-promotion, the stuff up in Wirral, I mean, that's Alan Evans, who's the director up there. I mean, that's his big vision for this whole site. It's about that mixed-use economy. So, you've got a whacking great bit of dockland, where you've got some really interesting housing projects on there through Urban Splash. You've got some really good commercial infrastructure that's on there. You've got some really interesting reuse purposes, but it's such a massive site, and with some of those kind of sites, having a framework, and to drag us painfully back to the white paper. I suppose the idea is that this is giving us some framework upon which we can start having maybe slightly more ambitious conversations than we would have had, and the regeneration model has always been to intervene when the market has failed. So recreating a market, having the courage to recreate and do something different, and not just be driven by a financial return, that's by very definition, isn't it? That's regeneration as opposed to redevelopment. So I think that's what this white paper is trying to do. It's setting out the framework to make us think slightly differently. The bit where I think it is still a bit aspirational and it will need more thought, but also this is back to the hope element. It very clearly sets out the role for the public sector and for the public-private partnerships. The policy framework that sits underneath this, there's a big interesting debate about the targets and the ambitions of these missions, because some of the missions are say 2030, and so you've got some people, if you did a Twitter poll on this, they'd say 2030, it's too far away, we need action now, blah blah. The exact flip side of that is 2030, that's only 8 years away. That doesn't give us any length of time to make massive societal and infrastructural changes. So I think again, back to the whole purpose of this, it's designed to give us a different framework to help us think, but it absolutely is the start of the journey. There is an awful lot still to do. You can't have regeneration on the size and scale that we've just been talking about, like with Belfast or with Wirral, for example, without the proper funding, without the local leadership, without the devolved powers, without the that sort of local holistic approach. And there's a big part of this document which talks about the need for further devolution, greater powers for the West, for the combined authorities, further push for community deals, county deals. There's a lot of devolution in this document, and the key to making it work is that element of devolved power. The bit that I think is a bit missing is, thanks, Andrew. The bit that I think is missing is there is still a slight nervousness, I think, from Treasury to devolve power. So the bit that I think isn't quite right here is that link between devolving power to local areas to allow them to get on and do it, but then the funding picture that sits behind it is still fairly centralised. So that's the bit that, as we move forward, I'm not 100% convinced is quite right yet. The ambition is here, and the outputs are here, and the sort of the analysis is clearly here, but the so what and what next isn't quite there.
So we've got some interesting questions coming through on Slido, and Jonathan Platt has a couple that are linked to that. So what is the expenditure window for each round of funding, and when is the fund coming available within each window? So sort of those sort of mechanics of, what's coming through. Not to put you on the spot.
I'm quite happy to be put on the spot because I can easily say I don't know. There's so many funds discussed in this document, from the Prosperity Fund, the Brownfield Fund. We've already had Towns Fund, Future High Streets Fund. So, and interestingly, the Shared Prosperity Fund is only 2.5 billion, which sounds a huge amount, but it's not really. If you make comparisons to equivalent exercises in Germany, for example, there's trillions made available. So that's why I link back to the idea of I'm not 100% convinced the Treasury is really on board with this. And there was a rumour, wasn't there, before the white paper was published, that the reason it had been delayed so often is because it didn't actually have full Treasury backing. So I think...
So is this really about trying to... Because there's, there won't be new money. Well, there will be some. But is this about trying to channel existing flows in the right way to deliver better outcomes? Or is it, I guess this comes back to old rope, but what do you do with it?
Well, this is the thing. You need a policy framework which everyone can buy into and have outputs and so on. And that analysis piece, which is why I say this is man not being able to multitask. I've got the chat here and I've got the pink screen here. Anyway, leave all that aside. I think what it tries to do is put the policy framework in place to tell us this is what the problem is. And that's sort of my query with this document. It's a very good analysis of the problem, but I'm not necessarily sure it comes up with the answers yet, because a lot of this is about saying we will put in a devolved structure, we will create new deals, we will create some funding structures. But I did an article on this the other day, and I still have a nervousness about this idea of councils having to bid for funding. On the one hand, yes, the funding has to have scrutiny, but if you're the poorest council, that means you've probably not really got the officers in place to do proper funding bids.
And you can't afford the consultants to...
So, that was my big beef with the Towns Fund. It went to some really interesting places, but because you had to have the buy-in of your MP, that sort of politicised it a bit in a way which I didn't think was terribly helpful. You also had, the feasibility phase that you had to do to do your bid. You were only given, it was about 100 grand. So that didn't really give a lot of scope to put a credible bid together. And then you had, and let alone the officer time that it took. So you've got this idea of, one of the lines in the white paper, which I may betray my political allegiances here, but there's a bit that talks about how how this process will be far easier and better than the European development funds. Well, not from what I've seen. The biggest problem with European Development Agency funding it wasn't that it was bureaucratically burdensome. That's not, and the papers today to get funding for these projects isn't exactly straightforward. So there is a bit of a nervousness of the politicization of some of this funding, and people talk about Boris boroughs, which is a bit painful. But you can't deny that the funding is being made available for spaces to do good things. But it's whether that funding is any different to the funding that was there before. I'm not entirely convinced. At least it gives us a framework, and it gives us a continued framework to be able to work to. And as I say, the most exciting and interesting part of this is the analysis of the problem. Because at least if you've got that combined view as to what the problem is, then clever people can start thinking of combined solutions.
So is this a good time then for our audience of, built environment professionals and supply chain partners to start engaging with the public sector around this topic? Or
I think it has to be. I mean, I've been doing public sector regeneration work for 20 odd years now, so I'm sort of a bit biased. But there are some fantastic public sector organisations out there who really understand regeneration. They've always been good people to engage with. And I know the public sector sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap for for engagement, or the procurement rules make it really difficult to engage and all of that kind of stuff. But I suppose what you've got now is, and what this paper is designed to do, is to give us a window where we can say, look, we've got a steer, we've got buy-in, we've got in theory central government approval to really attack these places, to go for the abandoned. We don't have the greenfield expansion doesn't have to continue. There is huge tracts of land out there which we can allocate an earmark and do something exciting with. So I think it's a brilliant, I've always thought this, but even more of a brilliant time to engage with the public sector, because there is a focus. And if there's a central government focus, that means there'll be a funding focus. And if there's a long-term funding focus from central government, that means the private sector will be more engaged. And you get that element of, there's a big part of this document talks about continued need for collaborative stakeholder engagement and partnership. And the whole public-private partnerships aren't anything new. We've been doing that for years. But I think what this does is it just seems to give us a little bit of a slightly more friendly environment from a policy point of view to have faith to engage.
So I'm going to ask a couple of the questions that are coming through now in Slido and in the chat, because I think some of these are kind of linked. There's one from Jonathan Platt about, does this link to the industrial strategy? Or is this, I won't say anything too political about that, but we've had this industrial strategy, which we've been following as a country. And, from a construction perspective, it's given us some clear direction about how we modernize and, look at how we deliver better value and outcomes for clients and society. Does this link to that in any way, or is it?
Yeah, I think it has to, because we divvied up the country in quotas, didn't we? With the industrial north and the northern powerhouse and the innovation centres in the Midlands and so on. And what the policy element of this, or the analysis element of this document does, it seems to break that down even more into understanding what areas are good at, and then they get into the whole skill shortage. So my reading of it, and I'm not an economist, but just a humble development lawyer at the end of the day. But my reading of this is it does give more direction, and it sort of builds on the industrial strategy that we were discussing a couple of years ago. So I think it probably does. and again, it's about highlighting specifics and specific areas. So talking about the sort of, it highlights, doesn't it, in certain sections, the direction of travel for, say, the Midlands or the West Midlands, and it talks about the industrial, and it's very specifically, in fact, gives some identified funding to the Midlands to talk about research and development, for example.
Mhm.
So I think it does do that, and I'd say this was a build upon the industrial strategy rather than anything sort of
So we've got a really interesting question come in from Mel Clinton, and actually this builds on some stuff that I saw in the States when I went on a study mission there a few years ago. The shape and nature of the national economy is a big factor. There's a disproportionate focus of investment in property and financial assets. Maybe we need a shared makerspace in each community. Local authorities need to be better funded. And this raises the issue of proper devolution, including fiscal. Linked to this, we need a well-resourced and positive planning system. Otherwise, financial value will always dictate. So we'll get all the things that we're seeing, residential, student accommodation, drive-through costas, which, they're not good for anybody. Well,
well, if you like absolutely scalding hot bacon sandwiches with one rasher of bacon, then Costas are marvelous. I was reading Mel's question when I was trying to read three different screens, and I think it's a point well made. I mean, the we're trying to get away from sort of androgynous towns and cities where they're all identical. And you do get into that space of thinking, communities grew up in the past based upon the industries that sat there, and the industries sat there because of the geography of the area, and the shipyards ended up in the places where there were ships and rivers, the coal mines grew up where there was coal, the potteries ended up where the potteries are for those reasons, and so the industries shaped the area. And there's a really interesting sort of historical lesson in this document, which I know some people have kind of scoffed at, about the history lessons. But it is sort of interesting about why places were shaped and by the industries that were there. So again, back to my Wirral example, there's parts of the Wirral which are absolutely beautiful. And the buildings that are there are amazing because they were built on the sort of Georgian wealth. And if you look at most of our cities, they evolved and were built around certain periods in their economic history. I think what's interesting about this particular point is about the building it based on the nature of the national economy. I think that's a really wise point to make. And I think that's what this document is trying to do in a way. It's trying to think, again, back to the very opening statement we made, what's the land for, not just what's it worth. So the need for this whole approach is because we were having a pretty disastrous economic picture. The whole pandemic has had an impact, and it has widened deprivation in certain areas. The impact of Brexit hadn't even begun when the pandemic started, but we will continue to see pretty big downturns in certain sectors because of Brexit, and part of this, I suppose, is again it's back to understanding what those places are for. I saw a town plan the other day for a medieval town, or a traditional medieval market town, and the town plan that had been prepared for it was awash with glass office buildings down by the riverside, and cafe culture, Renaissance stuff, and you think, oh blimey, no, it was the archetypal cut and paste from somewhere else, and not every little market town can suddenly become a metropolis.
And do we want them to?
That's the thing, and so it's an interesting time. Back to the sort of question: is this a good time to get involved with public sector? And I suppose it absolutely has to, because the great minds that will be part of this, of our participants today, this is the time for really innovative thinking, proper innovative use, not just going down the those kind of town plans that are very much planned by numbers, where everything's the same. It needs proper innovative, interesting uses for these sites. So I'm involved in the Arden Cross scheme at near Birmingham Airport, acting for Solihull and the Urban Growth Company. And I've loved that scheme I've been involved for years now. And what I love about it is there's going to be an HS2 station in the middle of it. So right, what do we build around? Let's challenge the government and say, do we really need 7,500 surface level car parking spaces? No, of course we don't. Let's have one multi-storey and we'll free up all of that land. And what are we going to do with that land? Well, we'll build a really interesting health campus, or we'll build some housing. We'll build a new town, but we'll do something which is forward-thinking and innovative. We'll use the green environment that's around. We'll link it to the airport in a better way. We'll link it to the road network in a better way. And this idea of being able to do something which is, innovative and different and new, and when the plans come out, people will decide whether it's different, innovative, and new. But I think it's giving us some freedom to not just build the same.
And I think that's actually linked to the most popular question on Slido, which is, we've got to be about creating new jobs, and asking if the government is joined up here, or are they just funding the cash and stations, etc., that people will not use, for example, in HS2. But actually what you're showing is, that it's not just about a station, it's about using that station to create a new ecosystem.
So HS2, let's talk. I don't act for HS2, but I have spent quite a lot of time with them over the last 5 years. HS2 was, I think, was missold. And this is why people say, how many billions of pounds to get there 20 minutes quicker? It should never have been called high speed. It should have been called high capacity or something else. But what HS2 is about is placing those stations to build things around. And it's a different type of connectivity and a different type of capacity. And the HS2 station in Solihull, for example, has got some amazingly interesting stuff going to be built around it. Same with Birmingham. So I think it's meant to do something slightly different. And building a fancy pants station, as the question sort of suggests, isn't the end goal. It's the enabler, I would argue. And then you get into the debate about, well, why did they stop the northern extensions and all of that sort of stuff, which it was, the integrated rail plan really should have taken it forward, in my humble view. I think it sort of loses a lot of its argument if you stop where it stops. But that's one for a different day. Is regeneration about creating jobs? I think regeneration is about addressing market failures. And by definition, that means not just creating jobs, but creating all elements of social capital. And so that does mean not just creating jobs, but it means creating places for people to recreate and to be otherwise, culturally enhanced, as well as having the jobs to go to. And if you look at part of the analysis section here, it talks about, if you want the outlying areas to be regenerated, you put the money in the city centre, because then it will feed into those spaces. If you've got a deprived area and you build a new community centre, that will have a great impact. There's so many examples of that where a really good community engaged centre is helpful. But there are arguments in the white paper, at least, say better to regenerate the city and put the money into the city, and then people and build the right transport links and so on, and then that will have that feed out approach. So it's got to be about more than jobs. I think creating jobs is one bit, but I think it's got to be about creating all elements of the social capital, and that's the factors that the levelling up seeks to drive towards.
So we've got another question which is sort of driving at the same thing. How do you build King's Cross in Blackpool?
So desperately trying not to think of something that doesn't sound just flippant. The first question would be, why would you want to build a King's Cross? You know, it's about looking at what does the place need. I mean, I remember we did a local government conference up in Blackpool years ago. It's about 5 years ago now, something like that. And the I think I'm guessing from memory, he was the council leader or head of Regen or something like that. And he said we've got to look at what Blackpool's good at, what it's famous for, and enhance that. Once we enhance that, then we can build the new stuff. So I guess to sort of expand on this question from Mr. Anonymous or Mrs. Anonymous, the King's Cross had when Argent did King's Cross, they had a really clear deprived part of London, which was famous for unsavory activities. And
I walked to there a couple of years ago. I came into Euston and decided to go the back way to a meeting at the new Argent development.
Yeah,
that was interesting. I was very glad. I walked back the long way.
Yes, well, there were, what's the phrase? Ladies of negotiable affection, and drug dealers and the like, and it was it wasn't a great place to be. So it had, because of where it was, because of its transport connections, because of the physical infrastructure, you knew that that would succeed in the long term, and you could afford to have patient capital invested into it, because it had all the right hallmarks and the right physical space, and it did build lots of different types of. It didn't just stick houses there. It built lots of things, and it had that trickle effect out. So how do you do that in Blackpool? Going back to what the chap there said is, look, we build and enhance what we've got, because that's why people come here. And then if you build on that, then it will have that kind of ripple effect outwards. And I think that's what Blackpool's been trying to do from I haven't been up there for a little while, but last time I was there, you do go there for the illuminations, and you do go there to go and visit the zoo and so on. And there's a load of really interesting good things up there. So I suppose you could argue it has a brand, it has an identity, it has a thing that it's famous for, that it's still famous for, and people still go there for that reason. And what they've enhanced is the transport infrastructure, so that you don't just go in and drive along, drive very, very slowly along the seafront and then drive out the other end. You do stay there. And, I was there with my wife and daughter last year, and, really nice hotels and really nice food and all that sort of thing. And it's building upon the thing it's famous for.
So do you think, so there's a question, or there's a comment in the chat from Paul Britton, and I think this builds in something that has come out a little bit of what you've been saying about, is this being communicated properly? So this question reflects the government announcement yesterday that Blackpool is one of the 20 places in the white paper and is looking to deliver a King's Cross level regeneration plan. And I think sometimes it sounds good to say it's going to be another King's Cross, but actually, does that manage our expectations, or does that put undue pressure on those towns to, this is a communications piece, a bit like HS2, it should have been sold on capacity and, the fact that we've got an overstretched railway system and we need a new line, as opposed to it's going to be quicker.
So I suppose, and thank you to Paul for highlighting that I didn't read yesterday's news. Busy trying to finish reading this bloody thing. The Towns deal, so one of the 20 places that's looking for that level of regeneration. I think what it means is, and having very quickly looked at the news from yesterday on my other screen, I think it's when people talk about the King's Cross level of regeneration, they just mean the transformative effect. So there are parts of Blackpool that clearly, because they are bound by one particular industry, don't have the rest. And it's that thing of, if you got it, so Andrew's down in Cannes, I presume, at the moment. You go, you walk along La Croisette and you think, wow, this is absolutely gorgeous. You go 3 streets back, and it's just like any other, not particularly nice town, and it's the same with Blackpool. You get the 3 or 4 streets at the front, or you go to somewhere like Rill, up in that neck of the woods, and it's really quite sad. There are some areas there where you just think, wow, this place could just do with some cash. And I suppose that's coming back to this. It's like, if you build the right heritage, so the Blackpool thing talks about the heritage quarter, and you build the right social infrastructure, you build the right physical infrastructure rather, everything else follows. So it's not you won't build a King's Cross type environment because you won't persuade someone like Google, for example, to headquarter there. Now, the flip side of that, you look at someone like Wolverhampton. Wolverhampton's been pushing government for years to engage with them and look at their transport infrastructure, which is why when they built their office spec office buildings right next to the train station and said, look, we are 20 minutes from Birmingham, we're an hour and a bit from London, whatever it is, build some offices here. So, of course, Department for Levelling Up relocates to Wolverhampton. And then that has the knock-on effect, because I'm advising on some of this as well. You've got something like the station quarter. Your former industrial sites there, massive old disused engine shed. You've got what was factory sites, contaminated ground or what have you, which are going to be regenerated for housing and leisure and a mixed use. And that whole mixed use economy is about saying, and again, I think the sort of King's Cross type wording is meant to be shorthand for that level of transformation. And the level of transformation you will get in Blackpool will be different because it will suit its purpose. And I think that's probably what that means, Paul, if I'm not oversimplifying it.
So linked to that sort of, I was talking to somebody about this morning, actually. They're in Darlington, and Treasury's is putting some offices into Darlington, and the impact that has. And also, I moved away from Northern Ireland for work, and there's so many people right across the country that end up in London and the southeast because of, but if those opportunities exist, then you don't have that upwardly mobile population having to move away. So there, and this links to the poll question, actually, if we could pull that one up. Is the public sector a strong driver of regeneration? So Howard, if we can pull up, or Abraham, if we can pull up that poll. Ooh, some people disagree.
I mean, it would be interesting to explore, and we haven't really got time now, but maybe we can do this, if you invite me back, we can have another one. I'd be interested to know why people think not. And it tends to be the very councils who really need this kind of help, where they haven't got the right officers, they haven't got the right experience, they haven't got, that's where it can fall down. So I'm doing a scheme at the moment where we were asked to join halfway through the process, the competitive dialogue process that started with developers, and we were asked to come in as a sort of deal doctor, and we had to sort of rewrite some of the documents and so on. And it was just because, if you're a small district authority and you've only got one town centre and you've not regenerated it before, why on earth would you have the necessary skills internally to do it? So for those kind of places, sometimes the public sector isn't the driver. It's the driver in a need analysis, but not necessarily the driver in a skills and resource thing. And if you look at, let's be blunt, public sector has had its funding absolutely decimated over the last 10 years. So, when this is where my sort of slightly lefty view comes out, you can't say to local government, you're absolutely vital to the effort, but by the way, we're going to pull your funding and cut your funding by 60-70%.
So I guess that links into one of the anonymous questions in Slido, which is, why should Homes England buy land for large regeneration rather than simply giving the money to devolved partners who are democratically elected? You know,
I've heard that question raised recently, and in fact in almost identical phrasing to that. So I wonder if it's the person who I was talking to. I mean, it's a genuine question. I don't know the answer to it actually. Homes England and other agencies, like public sector agencies, have always had an ability and an obligation to acquire. You know, we've had compulsory purchase powers and the like, to be kickstarters for regeneration, and again to address a market fail. And Homes England have sort of swung into that space. Again, we act for Homes England, so I have to be careful with that one as well. But there's a, I suppose it's in that space of saying the public sector has an obligation and has the powers and can be a Kickstarter. Whether that's right or whether that's the right policy or whether that's the right approach, you know, is one for another day. But I think as far as that debate about whether the public sector is a driver, you know, when we act for combined authorities, when we act for large city councils, they're a very different beast to acting for a small district council or a borough council. They can still have really good driving effects, but if you're a city council like a Birmingham, for example, where you've got the Commonwealth Games, you've got the Spitalfield site, the old market sites rather, you've got all the area around Digbeth, you've got, you know, vast tracts of land that can have money put into it and can be, you know, project managed and town planned. You compare that to, I don't know, somewhere like Warsaw, for example, you know, a much smaller footprint, far, you know, more constrained. You know, it just needs a different approach to kickstart that regeneration program. And again, thinking about whether this document does the right thing, it's going to be this next phase, which will determine it. Having the sort of, you know, these 20 original sites with Wolves and Sheffield, and now I'm now reliably informed Blackpool. It's only going to work if the regeneration output matches the need. Because just putting cash into a space, as we've seen many times before, you know, doing a beautification exercise of putting new park benches in or whatever, it doesn't work. That's just sort of, that's the window dressing. And I think and maybe that's the difference, that the levelling up document is about that wider, fuller regeneration picture rather than just some overview.
So we do need to wind up shortly, and there's a really interesting question in there about systems thinking, and, you know, should the NHS be investing in preventative measures like green spaces, etc., which we don't have time to go into, unfortunately. I think it'd be quite interesting to see the answers to the final poll. You know, what are those common blockers that people perceive in regeneration? You can just
while you're getting that up on screen, that does take us back to the sort of big society type approach about, you know, is prevention better than cure, and then you get into the whole debate about, well, where's the money sit within the NHS and with the investment partners and so on. And, you know, if you're a private healthcare provider, you don't get paid for someone sitting on a park bench.
Well, yeah. Yes. So money and red tape, those seem to be the two biggies, followed by skills and resource. And
so I find that really fascinating, because from someone who's on the front line of doing these projects, money, I'd never find money as a blocker, because there's funding available somewhere, whether that's public or private. The red tape bit, I think, is a really interesting bit. Whenever I'm advising a council, I always talk to them about unity and depoliticizing, getting the members on board. You know, that whole, it might appear really interesting to a member to tweet about his opposition to something in the council meeting, but actually just puts developers off. So that whole thing about being a unified council and having strong leadership. And there's a big part. In fact, the page I happen to have open in front of me in the white paper is about the principle of effective leadership and reducing the red tape, reducing the blockers. So I think the red tape bit is kind of an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
The skill shortage, I'll just quickly mention these because I think it is kind of important. The skill shortage bit, that takes back to that comment I made earlier about the difference between a big city council with a well-resourced professional sources team and a district council who hasn't got that and then has to buy in the skills and hasn't got it. And that sort of ties into resources as well. And the site constraints point, I'm not surprised to see that quite low down because by definition, if it's a rubbish site, that's probably why it needs regenerating in the first place.
Well, exactly. You're not going to regenerate the best places. So thank you so much, Chris. I think we could talk all day in this one. And thank you to all of those who participated and put Q&As in. We haven't got to all of them, unfortunately. Howard, do you want to mention the process for CPDs from today's session?
Yep. If people want to get a CPD certificate for today, you can do that by going to MyProPass. The information is there. You need to create a free account, and then you can actually store all your certificates for this and any other future events or past events on mypropass.co.uk. For those who are interested, please register for next week. We have another interesting topic next week. Do you want to put that up, Abraham? Have we got the information here?
Sorry, we don't have the information.
Oh, we don't have the information here. We're still awaiting it. So
we're still awaiting it, but it is the Seismic project, which is one of the Innovate UK demonstrator projects, which is looking at sort of setting groundworks for MMC. So some really interesting stuff going on there on that platform-based approach to delivering MMC systems. So that should be really good.
So thank you, Alison. Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. MMC is always interesting, so please do tune in. All I'm going to say is thank you very much to both Alison and to Chris for today. And from me, have a good weekend. I don't know if you want to say anything more, Alison or Chris.
No, this is fascinating. Chris, well done on digesting that document and sharing it with us, because I think there's a lot to go. I think this document's going to be quite groundbreaking for, how we approach things in the future. And that's going to have a knock-on effect on the construction industry.
It will, and I think it's an ongoing topic. I mean, we've done a whole week of levelling up articles and podcasts and discussions like this, and we've only scratched the surface. So yeah, it's an ongoing topic. Thank you for having me.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks very much. I see someone admired the rack of guitars, and I see a little Telecaster sneaked its way in there, light blue, very trendy. Have a good weekend with it. Look after your babies. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.